Welcome to our IARPIC May webinar here today with the IARPIC Risks team. And our webinar series aims to connect the community engaged in developing tools and also data sets to support communities affected by hazards, geohazards, climate, natural hazards, and also to identify opportunities in the tools and data development. And we'll have about half of the time for the presentation, and then we have a good time on the second half for questions and discussion in general, because we want to enable connections to happen for future collaborations. And thank you so much to Sandy Starkweather. She is our presenter today, and Sandy is a research scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado. She is grant funded by NOAA's Arctic Research Program to serve as the executive director for the U.S. Arctic Observation Network, to lead the interagency, non-federal, and international planning, analysis, and partnership and development initiatives that advances and utilizes Arctic observing and data systems. She has a background in energy systems engineering, Arctic climatology, and science, tech, and technology policy. So today she will share on observational assessment for risk and hazard topics. Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks, Anna. It's really nice to see everybody on the call today. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. There's a lot here, and I'll try to cover it effectively, and look forward to leaving some time for discussion as well. So I'm just going to set a timer for myself so I don't get too lost in the midst of all this. Okay, so as Anna mentioned, I'm going to be reporting out on a deliverable on it's an observing assessment related to gaps, and I should say strengths, because I'm going to talk about strengths in the observing system as well, related to the areas of risk management and hazard mitigation. And so this topic was identified, this broader topic of risks and hazards was identified by the USA on board as a prelude to the previous IARPIC implementation plan. Since risks and hazards was a new topic, they thought that this new work we were doing on developing observational gaps assessments would be a useful way to help kind of shape and understand the broader space of risks and hazards within an IARPIC context. And so this was a deliverable that kicked off in February of 2023 with that implementation plan. It was a 2-year deliverable, so we're a little bit past that 2-year deadline, but hopefully you can see that we've gotten quite a bit done during that period of time. I'd also like to recognize Hazel Shapiro, who's funded by the National Science Foundation through the IARPIC Secretariat, and Hazel supports really all aspects of the work that I'm presenting here. And so hopefully she'll join us in the question and answer. Okay, so the purpose of today is to really inform you about our progress, but also to engage in a dialogue about this approach, what you see in this approach that is of value to you, or what you would like to see in this approach, and of course, present our emerging results. And then we're also, as we always are, hoping to motivate you to contact us and to get involved with the work that we're doing to help guide decisions around the future of the Arctic observing and data system. So stimulating our next round of progress. So I'll just briefly set some context here to say that I mentioned earlier the U.S. Arctic Observing Network Board. It is a subcommittee of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. It is, unlike the priority area kind of collaboration teams, the board is a Fed-only body, and it's represented by the large dark blue facet in the center of this issue. And it really sits at the interface of the kinds of grassroots issues that maybe many of the kind of grant-funded people, or the more kind of boots on the ground operational or mission-oriented people, or people in communities are confronted with, that we could call science and technology issues related to observing in data systems. And they interface through their own agencies and groups like the IARC principles into the policy resource and planning space. And so this is really a kind of a science policy interface kind of conversation that we're having with the U.S. Arctic Observing Network. You can see who sits on the board now. We've had a lot of shuffling around lately, as you might imagine, but still quite a large amount of enthusiasm across our federal agencies, both those that you might think of agencies that more have data needs and agencies that you might think of as the data providing agencies. We are currently chaired by NASA, by Torsten Marcus, and our Vice Chair, David Allen, who I saw was joining us on the call, and Lauren Culler are also heavily involved in our leadership. So this board both serves as a key audience for the kinds of analyses that we're going to be talking about today, but they also really kind of help to shape the kinds of questions that we ask, and as I said, direct us towards topics and conversations that that help them do their work. And also respond to things like the 2022 call from Congress we had to report to them on gaps and strategies for the Arctic Observing Network. So I'm not going to go into deep background on either the deliverable itself or its approach, or where the deliverable came from or its approach, because we did do a previous extensive briefing on this on IARPA collaborations a little more than a year ago. So there's a link if this is a new topic for you. I hope you're able to still get a lot of value out of what I'm about to share next. And for background, I would refer you back to this presentation. I will highlight a few things about our approach that we followed here, which comes from US AON's benefit methods. And so benefit is one of those words / acronyms that we hope has meaning in both contexts, but you can unpack it to understand that that our methodology sort of both expresses a societal benefit evaluation, but using it specifically to explore how networks function and how we derive value from from lots of connectivity across networks. As I mentioned, we've applied this towards finding gaps with the overall goal of improving our networks together. I want to recognize that we did have a methods committee from outside the federal board for a 2-year period to help us develop our approach that we're going to be talking about here. I saw a few folks online. Corey Erickson, I saw before I clicked over to screen share, and hopefully some other folks from our methods committee. Bill Manley was there as well. And so I thank them for helping to shape this approach. Since the last time we spoke at that briefing I mentioned, we've done a considerable amount of tool development. So you've maybe seen some more legacy diagrams from our work, and I'll be sharing today what our diagrams look like in our crowdsourced online tool. And I will tantalize you that we are preparing a methods paper on this work that we'll share back certainly through the IARPA Collaborations website. So what I'm going to present today is what we came to call our first round deliverable for the risks and hazards work. And the first round deliverable recognized that risks and hazards is a big space to assess it all, would be beyond the capacity that US AON had. We always understood that we would be assessing 3 to 5 topics in this first round deliverable, but we collected a tremendous amount of information that will inform our ongoing work in this area. So today, or I should say the goals of the first round deliverable were first and foremost to generate useful findings. This was not simply an exercise in understanding how we wanted to approach this problem. And so we're going to look at some useful findings today, but because this is the first time we were doing it, we did put some work into really understanding how the proof of concept and these methods. And so here's some of the things that we were thinking about as we were moving forward in our proof of concept, and some of the things that we'll talk about at the end of this discussion as well. So a bit about where these methods come from. Benefit assessment comes from the family of tools known as that support multi-criteria decision making. They have elements of systems engineering to them. and are informed by other methodologies as well. They're widely used in federal agencies. Tools like this are widely used in federal agencies and in groups like interagency groups like the Group on Earth Observations to assess how observing systems are doing. I'm showing you here a report, the International Arctic Observing Assessment Framework, that described 12 broad societal benefit areas that are used to help assess the performance of the observing system. How well is it doing across the things that it should be doing? So, of course, the report goes deeper than 12 broad areas. It further describes these in 40 sub areas and 140 key objectives that a robust observing system should be meeting. There's some redundancy and overlap in these key objectives, and that's non-problematic. We understand there's different ways that different communities of practice think about what they're trying to achieve. This has been a useful tool for us. It's not a perfect tool, but it's been a useful tool for us to help advance our work. So how do we apply something like a societal benefit framework to understand how observing systems are performing? And that is where our benefit tool comes in. We want to, of course, give our thanks to NSIDC, where we've been developing this tool. This is something where Hazel's been extremely hands-on on behalf of our initiative and working with the developers here to develop a tool that can that can capture the information that we're looking for from subject matter experts who complete these assessments. These assessments focus usually on a key application or what we call a key product or service or objective. Here we're showing the Arctic Landscape Explorer that identifies permafrost changes on the landscape. And reading from left to right, our subject matter experts help us understand what observing systems they rely on to create the intermediate products that they use in their application. So it's kind of an anatomy exercise. How do you put this thing together? What are you using? But it's also a performance and criticality exercise. So they don't just tell us how they put it together. They rate the performance, how well the different elements are meeting their requirements, and they help us understand through things that are represented here by line thicknesses, how critical different inputs are to what they're trying to achieve. So you can see historical Landsat data in this depiction is slightly less critical than things derived from more recent visual imagery. And then on the right-hand side of the image is where the societal benefit framework comes in. So they help us understand how their particular tool or utility is supporting Arctic societal benefits. So the researchers self-assess, or the tool owners self-assess using a well-defined rating rubric and some other tools that we provide for them. So the benefit of approaching this with an online tool is first and foremost that it enables crowdsourcing. We can bring a lot of people in to use this tool is our vision for the tool. It enables things like object reuse. We now have more than 400 objects in our library. So if you're thinking, oh, I also use Maxar, that object's in the library. You can use it, reuse it, and show us how you use it. And then it creates ideally transparency around when we're rating and evaluating things, we can understand who's really rating them and evaluating them and in what context. Of course, because it takes time to develop utilities like this, we certainly still have some needs that we recognize. And if you do visit the tool, just know you're probably not going to be able to get started on your own because we are still working on training materials, but you can contact Hazel or myself for more information. So our overall approach for the first round deliverable fell into 4 phases. What we reported on in the previous webinar extensively was our scoping and content analysis, where we set out to talk to a lot of people to get the lay of the land, to understand what was most important to people, to figure out which of these 3 to 5 topics we should prioritize. And we wanted to do it in an inclusive and systematic way. We completed 63 dialogues with different organizations. While you can't see the dialogues themselves, you can refer to our website to see who we talked to and what the distribution was across different types of organizations. And you can also, from our content analysis, refer to the code glossary that was developed. And as we're incorporating some of the more recent dialogues, we still have a little more work to do before we're going to publish the completely updated findings. One of the things we look to identify during our scoping exercise is going back to this acronym: key products, services, and outcomes, which become the center point for our diagrams. And during our content analysis, we identified 120 of these KPSOs that would be great subjects for assessment. In our third phase, for those 3 to 5 topics that we plan to work on, we currently have 16 KPSO assessments in development. We'll be looking at the developing work of some of those today. And then these are being boiled down into topic-wise technical briefs. So we'll look at the topics in a minute, and then you can kind of wrap your head around, okay, there's a handful of these key products, services, and outcomes in each of these technical briefs that are going to be synthesized into some group-wise findings. So I just want to pause here because what I just described, a lot of people were involved in, and I hope many of you are on the phone and understand how grateful we are to the dialogue partners who helped us shape this exercise, to our first round subject matter experts who have come forward to do this work and to learn with us about good ways to do this. I mentioned that we had a methods committee. We also had a small research team through Taylor Rehos, who was one of our LaPenta scholars, John Orr, who was the Indigenous Engagement Specialist through the AARPIC Secretariat, Ryan Witten, who was part of Priority Area 3, Hazel, and several of our board members. I mentioned some of the funding support we see for this, and of course, the AARPIC collaboration space has been incredibly useful for moving this work forward. Okay, so let's get to results. So the topics that emerged from our first round included what you see here: coastal flooding, wildflowers, not wildflowers, wildfires. You can tell what time of year it is and where my brain is at. Aviation weather and landslides. And then we also are going to include sea ice, but that's going to come out later in the summer. You might have noticed that we're aiming for a midsummer deliverable date for the technical briefs on the other topics. And so what did these look like? What's included in these topics? So I'll start with coastal flooding, a scope through which we identified 9 KPSOs, key product services and outcomes. There are, of course, many more. The ones that made it into the first round, not only were they a good fit for assessment, but we had ready and willing subject matter experts to come forward and champion the assessments. We hope that we can tempt a few more people in through a call like this to say, hey, I want to be a part of that. And you will be part of an updated round, not part of the first round. But as you can see, one of the things we learned in our scoping was that we wanted to group things by mission areas. And these were real typical mission areas and risks and hazards, thinking about planning, forecasting, emergency response, and recovery types of services and outcomes. You can hopefully recognize, if this is your subject area, some familiar tools here that you might yourself use. And many of these are very broad and community-wide tools. So while there's only 9 of these in the assessment, something like Alaska Water Level Watch, as being a collaborative forum, pulls a lot together in one place and makes a really ideal topic for assessment. So I'll just start running through this in kind of a pattern for each of these topics. So one of the things I mentioned that we really, in addition to identifying gaps, you inevitably identify key strengths. And so this assessment on topography LiDAR and the subsequent products like DEMs that come out of it, led by Aaron Chokum, Maggie MacArthur, helps to illustrate how DEMs topobathy in this case, but DEMs come up in a lot of our assessments, are so broadly useful. And we've heard about them on these calls. I think even our most recent call on the risks and hazards was related to DEMs. Again, reading through the model, and I know a lot of the text kind of disappears when we make these smaller static downloads. You can see here, purple lines are indicating areas where we're doing pretty well. Things are functioning and values being delivered in a good way. Areas that are in more of a lighter turquoise or green, these are areas where we need to be actively working on our improvement. I know some of the ones that don't have labels relate to things like the NLON network and other forms of bathymetry that get ingested into these types of exercises. So definitely through our assessments, we've been identifying key strengths. This as yet unrated assessment by Rich Buzard, who was formerly with USGS and is now with ANTHC, really centered on some capabilities that came online through MERBOC disaster relief funding, which were focused on enhanced modeling through functionality like the Cosmos model and the HERA model, water level modeling, and also augmented in situ water level monitoring in 30 communities. And so while the enhancements of Cosmos and the additional water level monitoring in these 30 communities is significant, there are still far more communities that have little or no capabilities. They were not the ones affected by MERBOC, and so the funding didn't fan out, though these capabilities do illustrate what relatively moderate but significant investments can do to advance disaster preparedness, weather and climate understanding, infrastructure and operations in Alaskan coastal communities. Back to what I mentioned earlier, Alaska Water Level Watch. Here we can see the great value of investments in data assembly efforts. And so Alaska Water Level Watch is not itself an observing system. It is a forum for assembling crowdsourced water level data through data portals. And this group also works extensively on strategic build outs for water level sensing. And so I do want to acknowledge that the kinds of work that we do at USAON, we tend to focus more on a larger global scale to get kind of policy attention around what these issues are and where investments are needed. Our work would be very incomplete if it weren't for efforts like Alaska Water Level Watch that goes into the community by community level detail of specifically what they recommend for these communities in order to up their game in terms of preparedness. So, we need these partnerships where people are looking across levels of scale at these issues. Okay, so next I will turn to wildfires. And so within the scope of wildfires, we identified 7 KPSOs that we're going to work on in the first round assessment. Here, there were a number that were worth adding that were related to research products. So products that, while they focus on very use-oriented applications like fire weather predictability, fuels and severity, they are being developed in a research and exploratory fashion to inform other efforts. And so I'll just jump right in and show you some of the results from this section. So again, kind of getting back to the concept of what are the strengths of what's happening in the space of wildfires. One key strength we saw was certainly through the GINA capabilities, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. So, and this also starts to get into where do we need to think about our methodology in different ways so people can begin to bring in the stories that they think are really meaningful about the types of activities they're doing. in this case, Christy Buffington and Jen Delamere really wanted to say, hey, this isn't just about us having an antenna. This isn't just about us being an observing system that can provide quick looks across a range of disaster preparedness work. This is really about our broadcast experts, the people we need to take what this infrastructure is capable of and translate it into great value in areas like all of the ones we could talk about on the phone today. They're also active in work on flooding and weather and other topics, sea ice. But this is looking at what they're doing specifically through fire management. And so you start seeing things leap out like experts and user support. And if you note from our earlier diagrams, we maybe didn't think about this when we developed our methods to include these types of capabilities, but I think this is certainly going to inform how we do things moving forward. Um, in addition to collecting information like the diagrams you see here, I just wanted to emphasize that our technical briefs are going to be very media rich. So we want quotes from people like the Anchorage Fire Department chief that you see here that can be linked back to the work that Jen Schmidt's doing at ISAR on her wildfire exposure GIS. Both because it just tells a richer story, but again, we understand that our methods in these diagrams alone maybe don't really convey the direct utility that so many of these things that we've been assessing have to people really boots on the ground working on issues like wildfires. Another finding that has come out in many of our conversations is related here. Your eyes are probably always going to go to the yellow lines in these diagrams because that's really where we're worried about our capabilities. And here, Jen gave a very high criticality rating to NASA's above land cover database for its incredible utility in helping understand wildfire exposure in the state. But she kind of panned it on the performance rating because this data set is not going to be sustained after the above program is done. And this is really problematic because its value is already starting to degrade uh, and and not be able to serve the purposes that it's going to need to serve. So sustainment, sometimes we have the capabilities in the present moment, but for things being on revolving funds or other reasons, we're not always able to give them as high a performance rating as we otherwise would. I mentioned landslides, so there's only one kind of, if you will, KPSO. It's actually four different capabilities in one. It's quite a complex diagram, and we're really grateful to Gabe Woken, who worked very arduously on this diagram to tell a very complex story. We know that landslides are an evolving threat in Alaska, and many groups are scrambling to understand what can be done to better assess and understand the nature of that evolving threat. And so Gabe really undertook this exercise in a unique way, which was he wanted to put in capabilities that are needed and not yet present. And so he used the performance scale to code these accordingly. Maturing or somewhat available capabilities he showed in the mid-range, and then current capabilities that are already being utilized for this in the purple. So this really tells a succinct visual story that if we want to be doing a good job with the evolving threat of landslide hazards in the state, there's a real need for investment in observations, mapping, and data assembly. And last but not least, and again, kind of building on the theme of letting people take these assessments in a direction that they found most useful, learning from our methods, Jesse Cherry and Rick Toman worked together to help tell the story of airport weather observations in the state of Alaska, which both serve the critical need of aviation safety, but also serve a secondary and an essential need of providing travel information to a lot of different kinds of travelers throughout the state, and also support ongoing development of climate products in the state of Alaska. And so here in the sustainment category is the issue of aging infrastructure, frequent data transmission outages that are impacting all of these downstream needs. Um, as Jesse and Rick have both helped us to understand, the FAA is the major source of quote unquote NOAA weather and climate data in the state. And this has created a vulnerability for some of these needs. And so Jesse really kind of took our diagram off in a different direction that we think is really interesting, and we've learned a lot from, where she really wanted to parse the observing data transmission and low-level data dissemination systems apart from the higher order products. And as I mentioned, to outline not just how the system is wired together, but how a failure in something like a voice line communication for weather systems has so many knock-on effects downstream, impacting traveler decisions, DoD operations, the private sector, determination of flight aviation rules, and more. And so this is really emphasizing the story of impacts and de-emphasizing the story of performance and criticality, though we do have a version of this in our tool that emphasizes that as well. So I have to start doing a quick wrap up. I know I'm a little bit over here. So I wanted to return to the goals of the first round deliverable, which was first and foremost to generate useful findings. And I hope you can see that our subject matter experts are well on the way to assisting us in generating these very useful findings. And we've also been able to, I think, establish our proof of concept and learn some lessons along the way that are really going to help us with our next generation of work in this department. And so I will summarize the progress on those two goals to say that we can say at a very high level, in addition to the detailed findings, that managing risk and mitigating hazards in Alaska, a multi-agency approach, including state agencies and actors across all different scales, from communities through academic institutions, we're all really relying on each other's data and information. It's clear that gaps are a big part of the story. We've seen in many of these diagrams critical capabilities that are not meeting requirements in the state of Alaska. But it's also a story of strengths, which are related to sustainment risks. And so some of those sustainment risks relate to aging infrastructure, and some of them, like the above example, relate to great capabilities that are currently supported through research funds that are soon to expire. For our proof of concept, we really valued the diversity of conceptual approaches, and we've got some work ahead of us to understand how to learn from these approaches, and move towards something that meets a wide variety of people's conceptual understanding of what we're doing, but also maybe moves in a direction towards greater coherence, and reuse. Um, we understand that there are many value-added capabilities, boundary spanning organizations, people, and data centers that are less visible in our assessments. And so we hope that our more media-rich technical summaries help us to convey those stories. And then, of course, one of our ongoing efforts through all of this is focusing on streamlining our workflows. And even in the last few months, we've learned a lot about how we can better utilize things like large language models and artificial intelligence to help us reduce the amount of time our subject matter experts need to spend on several of these steps. We're happy to say we have a LaPenta scholar also this summer who is a computer scientist who's interested in these topics and is going to help us both with this and creating better training materials on our website for our users. So I mentioned that there are 120 key products, services, and outcomes that we've identified in our scoping dialogues and other forms of contributed content that we evaluated. And some of the topics that relate to those items are listed here. And one of our discussion points will be a desire to hear from you about that list and this list as well. Of course, this isn't as detailed as it could be, but it gives you a flavor that certainly our work here is not done. We're really happy to be approaching the end of our first deliverable, but we would very much like to continue work in this area. If you are inspired and want to work on one of these topics, please contact us. So next steps. Today, we want your input, and I have a few discussion questions on the next slide. We are entering into, we've tagged some additional subject matter experts to support review, which we're hoping is happening in early June, and that we can have our content finalized by the end of June. Hazel's been developing her wizardry skills at desktop publishing, and so we will desktop publish these technical briefs and make them available on our website. And then our next steps, of course, are going to be to initiate an ongoing round of assessments. And so what we thought would be some useful things for discussion today is kind of understanding at the conceptual level, you've seen kind of a range of different conceptual approaches. I didn't share as deeply on the content of the technical briefs, but it would be useful to understand how this work might support your needs. We understand that from our existing topics that they all could be enhanced with other dimensions, other types of observing systems, other types of applications. And so we'd love to hear you weigh in on that. And also just, hear what kind of future topics you might want to see us talk about. And so maybe I could ask Hazel to copy these questions into the chat. So I can just go to our thank you slide and show you our emails, how you can get in touch with us, our website, and to once again thank our funders who have really helped us develop this work over the long haul. We appreciate your support for us. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Sandy. Much appreciated. All right, Sandy got questions for us. And maybe you have some questions for her too. So let's hear what your thoughts and comments and questions are. If you prefer to write in the chat, go for that. Otherwise, yeah, raise your hand or grab the microphone. Go for it, Hayo.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Sandy and Hazel. Obvious question. I mean, you touched indirectly on this a bit, but if you have any additional thoughts on how can this approach be used to also now clearly document the loss of capabilities and potential risks associated with shutting down or significantly reducing in scope federal programs. Is that something that you have on your radar, or is that something that others should, of course, because you've now created these great tools, maybe you're not able to do it, but are there others that one could team up with to actually look at this in more detail?
Yeah, it's a great question, Hayo, and I think it gets at the sustainability issue. So we think these tools are really tailor-made for telling that story, to be able to illustrate the impacts of the loss of capabilities. And so I could have maybe emphasized or underscored this further. One of the limiting factors in developing this work is that Hazel and I are a pretty narrow pipeline because this is not 100% of our work. This is, in fact, I probably don't even want to say what percentage of our work this is. So we would really welcome any type of partners, anybody who wants to come forward. We're happy to train you in your organization on how to do these diagrams yourself. You really don't need us to do the diagrams. but because of our experience in using in kind of answering certain questions over time, we do sort of hold on to a lot of that knowledge. But the goal is for people to be able to use these themselves. If there are urgent questions that you feel like we need this diagram yesterday, please come forward and let us know. But hopefully you can also come forward with somebody who can help us do that work. I should note too that so this was kind of a subtle thing in how Gabe Woken approached his diagram. We do have a way to define a diagram as either current capabilities or hypothetical capabilities. And so through identifying something as a hypothetical state, it can either be a degraded hypothetical state or an enhanced hypothetical state. So you can make that distinction in the tool for that work.
Thank you, Hayo. I'm going to sneak in a question. Sandy, have this kind of work been done for other states in the country and focusing on hazards? And if so, like what is really sticking out for Alaska compared to others?
Well, Anna, I learned a lot from what you just shared with us last week about the geophysical spatial data assessment. And maybe you could share that in the chat because I think that's a great reference. While this has not been done at a state-by-state level that I'm aware of, there is a national civil Earth observing assessment that the federal agencies undertake through the U.S. Group on Earth Observations. They look at different topics. They look at federal only capabilities. And then NOAA does some internal assessments as well, and it is currently starting a new assessment related to coastal systems, and it does want to partner with us on a focus in Alaska. I would say that we approach things at a more kind of detail-oriented level, and I haven't seen as much visual support from some of those other assessments. But there are other activities like this that do this type of assessment for similar purposes.
Well, yeah, I shared the link, geospatial maturity assessment, and it's Alaska has a lowest grade, D. It's not a D minus, I guess it's not the lowest, but it's down there. All right, I think I saw. Brent has a question. Are you able to identify the importance of an individual system or intermediate product across one of the topics?
Yeah, so what I did not show is, and it's a great question. So these assessments are one form of visualization. And we have been developing a complementary form of visualization where, so each one of these topic-wise assessments is going to be accompanied by a quad plot that has the axes of performance and criticality for all of the things that were entered for all the KPSOs. And in that quad plot, those things that fall into the category of high criticality and low performance, we call that quadrant advance. And that's one of the in the kind of key takeaways part of the narrative. That's where we really focus on the types of investments that are needed to fill spatial gaps, to advance technologies. It might be a research type of investment that's needed to that type of thing. And then we also look at those things that are high performance and high criticality, and that's the sustainment conversation. And so we do intend to look across when all of our subject matter experts are done with their data entry, we do intend to look across and make those quad plots. I just didn't want to show anything prematurely in this setting because it could be misleading about our findings. It is also a downstream ambition that once we build up our library to a greater degree, that people could make assessments on specific societal benefit areas. So if there's a societal benefit area related to natural resources or related to a certain type of ecosystem, that you could develop an analysis view drawing in everything in the library that relates to that. So as we continue to advance our tool capabilities, we hope to be able to support higher order queries and assessments that are more dynamically generated than these.
Thank you. That was really nice. Now, exactly what I was looking for. And I did want to say hello. I'm will be the one with Noah, who I'll be reaching out to you. Meredith sent me over here to talk to you or to sit in on this about the Resilient Coast refresh Noah's doing, and it's really neat seeing the parallels between the process y'all have developed and the process we have. And I think we can definitely take a lead from you guys on some of the visualization, and hopefully we can show you some of the scoring and analytics stuff that we're able to do on our side, because I think we've done some of that Sankey chart work before using Tableau, but I think that the open source utility, and I've just been trying to read up on your tool, is going to be really useful. It's a much easier way to show the relationships than we typically have the ability to do with what we've got, with how we've got our data set up right now.
Great. We're really looking forward to working with you guys, Brant, and super excited. And oh, hi, Matt Fisher, giving us a heart, who was our developer for our amazing tool. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, yay, open source.
Fabulous. Great. I'll sneak in another question then. So I don't see anything other in the chat, right? Yeah. So as you develop these and had these discussions, like as you're designing the presentation of the findings, like, are you considering the language that is being used in hazard mitigation plans? Because oftentimes, at least it used to be, FEMA, for getting funding from FEMA, disaster funding, you had to have a hazard mitigation plan in place, which a lot of Alaska's remote communities are missing. So as you prepare this data and present it, like, are you considering like how you can sharpen the language or focus the language to so that it can be specifically like linked into the hazard mitigation planning efforts that are sort of the foundation for dealing with hazards?
Yeah, Anna, that's a great question. So I mentioned that content analysis at the beginning, and one of the things that we tagged were different mission areas, and hazard mitigation plans came up a lot for many of these topics. And while I haven't mentioned it yet, we would like to do, once we feel like we've got more of these topics under our belt, we would like to do a capstone effort where we draw broader conclusions around the risks and hazard space more generally, about these specific gaps that are inhibiting the development of hazard mitigation plans at the community level. Another topic that was very cross-cutting that came up quite a bit was infrastructure mapping. That that almost all of these topics, it's really difficult to manage what needs to be managed well without adequate infrastructure mapping. And I think a lot of these baseline utilities like DEMs and bathymetry, reference datums, those types of things, those seem to be also coming out quite a lot too. Another topic that I think we'd like to do that's cross-cutting in nature is we continue to come across communities, especially indigenous communities, that are making greater and greater use of drones in their communities to supplement what's not available through these other types of tools. And I think it would make a really nice technical brief just to explore how communities are using drones and how that could potentially really change the risk management and hazard mitigation landscape in the state.
Great. And one point I also wanted to make, like on one of the last slides, the future efforts that you're going to continue to dive into is the permafrost / erosion. And I got to meet Garrett at the State of Alaska Hazard Mitigation Office, and he emphasized that the word erosion is a kind of a trigger at the federal level, and it's not helpful to use that word when you talk about permafrost hazards. It's much more helpful to use sinkhole, for example, which is one of many permafrost hazards. But I think being aware of the language that is specific terms that could be helpful, or the other ways, it could also be, yeah. That's one example of it where I think a word to really be intentional where you use the word erosion.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's why I'll just again emphasize that the subject matter experts are at the heart of all of this. Hazel and I provide the technical assistance to kind of guide and shape this information. But we would really not get anywhere on this if it wasn't for people helping us get the language right, get the context right. And really share that, we really view this as a tool for subject matter experts to tell their stories and communities of practice to tell their stories, which is why we've shown a lot of flexibility in how people use them right now, because, we don't want to impose our kind of preconceived notion of what the story is, but it's really helpful to hear you say that. And even just in bringing subject matter experts in, getting the language right is very important.
Yeah, and I think that's something that most earth scientists don't recognize, that erosion is a very unique word when it comes to disaster management. And so I think now you built up that library, that knowledge, and summarized in these beautiful graphs from the subject matters experts. And I think maybe the next thing when you have that compiled would be to bring in people that are dealing with hazard mitigation plans and reviewing disaster funding applications to get the wording so there's a good connection there, and hopefully what you're producing can identify areas that needs more funding, more support. Thanks, John. Do you want to speak up to your post there?
I don't know if I have much to add to it other than this is a group that DHS Science and Technology is funding for looking at building a drone community that is looking at DHS hazards, which includes the hazards we're talking about here. So if there's interest in having a follow-on discussion or bringing them in for a conversation, that's something that I can facilitate. And I think there's a link there to the page. So also people feel free to reach out directly if they want to. Just let me know. Either way. Thanks.
That would be super useful, John. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you so very much, Sandy. See, we have someone else that have some thoughts or comment. Go for it, David.
Hi. So I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but I wanted to say thank you, Sandy and Hazel, and Hazards team for putting this on. This is an amazing body of work, and I think the fact that it is finally open source and available for folks to use for whatever application they see as appropriate is going to be massively important. And I see, like Anna noted, that this could be a really important tool in empowering communities and enabling them to communicate in ways that they haven't been able to do before. I also appreciate Hayo's point that it's also an opportunity to communicate the impact and of the potential loss of programs. Bottom line is that there's so many different applications of this tool, and you've already come up with insights that are that present, I think, in a more rigorous way what we've been hearing from folks in Alaska for years, that we are not prepared. We don't have the same level of coverage and observations as the lower 48, even even the least well served of the lower 48. So it's a really important tool. And I just wanted to say thanks, and I look forward to the eventual crowdsourcing, the development of these training tools, so that people really can just go out and start using this tool and really for that wide variety of applications. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Agreed. Lots of thanks from the comments section here. Appreciations for your presentation, Sandy, and thank you all for sharing resources here as well. And yeah, we have our lineup for the fall presentations in the works. So if you would like to present on hazards topics relevant to Alaska, or if you know someone that you would love to see here, let us know. Hazel, Sandy, me, or John, Liza, Tom, let us know, and we will arrange that. And thank you, Sandy, and thank you all for coming, and you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, Sana. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks
all.
so much.